So, what the heck is Nod Krai? For years now, whenever we go to a new region or a new subregion, we at least have some hints or some insights on what the region is like. We've known about places like Chenyu Vale or the Chasm before we actually got to explore it, and we had a decent amount of information on those places before we actually got to go there. Before the Petrichor map update and the albeit lackluster introduction of Beta Harbor, we've heard mention of the harbor in the game before. There are other locations in the game we've known about for a while now, but haven't yet visited. Examples include Dornman Port, Blackcliff Forge, Mont Isis West, and the Mare Jabari. But the mention of Nodcry just came out of nowhere. Really, we only have Lieben's account of Nodcry, as well as a brief mention of the location in the 5.3 livestream. In fact, let's take a look at this Nodcry region. So, from both Lieben and the 5.3 livestream, we learned that Nodcry is an autonomous region in southern Snezhnaya. Lieben mentions that Nodcry plays by its own rules, and insinuates that it's a lawless place. He also mentions that the Voynich Guild is the strongest faction within Nodcry. In the 5.3 livestream, we are told that various factions linger in Nodcry for their own purposes, and that Nodcry will be a vastly different experience from the other 6 nations. That last point in particular is very interesting, because, well, what does a vastly different experience even entail? What does that even look like? Well, let's discuss some possibilities. Of course, the most straightforward way for Nodcry to be added would be to just have it encompass a single region expansion in one patch. Think of something like Chenyu Vale being introduced in the Fontaine patches, or the Chasm being introduced in the Inazuma patches. Maybe the Nodcry region will just be our introduction to Snezhnaya and release in version 6.0, but that seems a little anticlimactic to me. The devs specifically mentioned that Nodcry will be a different experience from any other region they've released in the past, and having just another single-time map expansion encompassing all of one patch seems very samey to me. I guess an argument could be made that perhaps the new mechanics or quests or even method of entry into this region would be new and innovative, and that's what the devs meant by their words. This by far seems like the safest route for the devs to go down, but I don't know if I want to call it the most likely yet. I guess we'll see. There are still many places on Teyvat that could become future playable areas. It's definitely possible to fit all these expansions into the remaining Natlan expansions, as well as Snezhnaya and Conria's timeline, but it seems a little crowded to fit all of those expansions in the span of 2.5 years. I'm proposing that perhaps Nodcry could become an entire chapter by itself. Now, I know that this theory has been floating around the internet for a bit, ever since the livestream, but there's a lot of factors coming together that makes me think that the Nodcry region will act as a Chapter 5.5, or maybe Nodcry and Snezhnaya will both encompass Chapter 6, where Nodcry is something like Chapter 6.0, and maybe the rest of Snezhnaya would be Chapter 6.5 or something like that. The specifics need to be worked upon. Lieben mentions Nodcry as a region autonomous from Snezhnaya. The devs refer to Nodcry as a vastly different experience from the other regions, and apparently there are many different factions within the region. Perhaps the different factions in Nodcry all come from different nations, making Nodcry this cultural melting pot. I think that this could be a really cool concept, and from the hints that we get about the various factions in Nodcry, as well as it being separate from Snezhnaya in some capacity, I think the region could definitely go in this direction. If Nodcry really does become a separate region from Snezhnaya, that could honestly free up a lot of space for Snezhnaya and Conria expansions. Snezhnaya is the biggest region in Teyvat, after all. Perhaps the Nodcry patches could even include another smaller Snezhnaya expansion, just so the actual Snezhnaya chapter doesn't need to cover as much area. Perhaps the Nodcry patches will release multiple expansions in southern Snezhnaya, holding off the capital city and the colder parts of the nation until the actual Snezhnaya patches. Looking at the map of Genshin, Snezhnaya will probably cover the distance between Fontaine and Mondstadt at the very least. Fontaine stretches far more northward compared to Mondstadt, and though Dornman Port will probably expand Mondstadt quite a bit, I posit that we will enter Nodcry through Mondstadt. The Nodcry patches could see the traveler going back to all the regions we've previously explored in our journey, and experiencing new stories and areas within them. Perhaps whoever we meet and ally with in Nodcry will have incentives for us to actually go to these regions, making the story connect with the different nations we revisit. One of the weird things about getting Chenyu Vale in the Fontaine patches was the fact that there wasn't really a good incentive for us to go to Chenyu Vale in the first place. It wasn't like Fontaine wasn't accessible, it was plenty accessible through the Girdle of the Sands in Sumeru. We just kind of went to Chenyu Vale at a random point in our story without any real reason besides Lantern Rite. If we had incentives to go to places like Dornman Port or Mont Isis West, that could make for a really interesting story and gameplay experience, as the players won't know what region they will be going to next. Perhaps this could all tie in with the Fatui as well, since Nod Krai is the most affiliated with Snezhnaya. People were speculating that Sandrone would show up in the Fontaine patches, as her entire design fits in with the clockwork motifs of the nation. She could probably fit into a future expansion of Mont Isis West. Additionally, Pantalone might show up in Nod Krai, seeing that it is an area Liban associates with wealth and riches. I'm just spitballing here. The last thing I want to mention about Nod Krai potentially being a buffer between Natlan and Snezhnaya is that Nod Krai might give us ample time to even out the roster in Genshin Impact. Although it definitely makes sense that more recent nations have less characters because, well, they are more recent, the big drop-off in characters between a region like Liyue and a region like Fontaine is quite noticeable. This problem might be addressed if Nod Krai were to be released as a separate chapter, as Nod Krai could just focus on adding more characters from Fontaine and Sumeru instead of more Mondstadt characters. Of course, it's unlikely that the balance of the number of characters per region will ever be perfectly even, but trying to make the roster less Mondstadt and Liyue heavy is definitely a worthwhile endeavor in my opinion. Overall, this is quite an exciting period in Genshin Impact. We have no clue what's coming in the future, or how exactly it will be presented, but I definitely feel like things in the story and the production of the game have been ramping up, and so far, Natlan has been an absolute treat. If Nod Krai just ends up being an expansion in 5.6 or 5.8, then hey, I hope it truly is a unique experience like the devs said it would be, but I think it's definitely possible for Nod Krai to be an entire chapter by itself, where we just focus on a centralized hub in southern Snezhnaya, and slowly branch out to other regions for story purposes. Whatever might happen with this elusive region, I am really optimistic.